Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Rik Glauert. It's been 3 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, launching a war that has killed more than 12,000 Ukrainian civilians and sent 6 million others fleeing the country as refugees. And those numbers continue to rise. Joining soldiers on the front lines and civilians in shelters are journalists who feel a duty to document life under wartime for all the world to see. Today, to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine through the lens of a photojournalist, we are joined by Matthew Rodier, a photojournalist who spent the last few months in Ukraine. Matthew, could you tell us why you wanted to go to Ukraine and what you hoped to capture?
Ukraine's an interesting story for a number of reasons. I think that any conflict or war is important from a news gathering perspective. And obviously, people need to have those stories told. Ukraine is particularly interesting because there hasn't been a war in Europe since the Bosnian War almost 30 years ago. And Ukraine is unique in the fact that it's the most advanced technologically as far as warfare that we've seen in the world. Drones particularly have played a greater role than in any other conflict that we've seen, and are generally regarded as having changed that war and all warfare going forward to a certain extent. But if you look at some of the themes that are, taking place in the war and some of the things that are causing it, you have an aging leader who pines for the, territory that his nation held when he was a younger man and seeks to reclaim it. There are some classic themes that you see recurring throughout history as far as conflict's concerned.
You mentioned capturing the people and their will to survive. What struck you about everyday Ukrainians' war effort?
I did spend some time in Eastern Ukraine documenting a drone unit, drone and anti-drone unit. But the majority of my time this last trip in Ukraine was centered around not directly the fighting, but those that are trying to evacuate people who are in, incredibly dangerous situations in, towns and small cities that are by the front line that are being bombed routinely, most of them daily. If you look at the areas the Russian army has occupied in Eastern Ukraine, there's always a front line, but then there's miles or kilometers behind that are subject to all the same weaponry that you're seeing at the front line, but it's primarily civilians that are being impacted by that. So if you look at, pictures or video of places the Russian army has overtaken, by the time Russian boots end up on the ground, those communities are mostly rubble because they've already battered them with ordnance. And a lot of this trip was centered around evacuations, specifically being done by a humanitarian organization by the name of Dobre Sprava, which roughly translates to good news. And what they're doing is every day they run usually 2 vans to different parts of Eastern Ukraine, often Donetsk, but also Zaporizhzhia. And these are, oblasts where the bombings are occurring most frequently and where the destruction is the greatest. It's not hyperbole to say that they're saving people's lives every day. What struck me the most, I guess, is that you see, these are all, it's governments and militaries, but when someone bombs a farmhouse or when someone rams a drone into a humanitarian vehicle, these are all choices that human beings have made. So you're seeing other individuals who are making the choice to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and drive to the most dangerous place on earth to save the lives of strangers. It's a situation where a lot of photojournalists that cover conflict or war have spoken about this before. You can see the worst humanity has to offer as far as how we treat each other, and you can also see the best in the same day. And that's sometimes tough to reconcile, but I believe that's just the nature of war.
You mentioned these areas that are close to the front line, sometimes just kilometers away from fighting. Could you tell us what life is like for the people that are still living there?
It was one of the things that struck me in the beginning is why people hadn't fled earlier. But as I took more of these trips and interacted with more of these people, a lot of these areas are rural. They're very much disconnected from life in bigger cities in Ukraine. And a lot of these people have a great connection to their community, and their home is their major asset, and they've lived there their whole lives for generations. And it's difficult for them to flee because it's all they've ever known. And, they're looking at, an uncertain future in Kiev or in Dnipro or in Kharkiv, in a larger city. It starts to make more sense when you see the level of anxiety and really the level of uncertainty that they're facing by leaving their homes.
This is one of the first truly modern digital technological wars. Is that something you were able to capture through your photography, and what did it look like?
I documented a drone unit, an anti-drone unit, and the gentleman that runs that unit, the commanding officer, was a gentleman who goes by the call sign Basket because he'd played basketball prior to joining the military. And him and I, through a translator, had discussed how there's essentially an arms race going on at the border, because at the front line, because there's the Russian military, Russia's population is a lot larger. And because of that, as through attrition and casualties, Ukraine has come to rely more on drone warfare as a means of defense. That's essentially spurred a localized arm race where, the jamming technology for drones is evolving. And then as the jamming technology for drones evolves, the people firing drones on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, then they're adapting tactics to overcome those defenses, and then that leads to other defenses, and it's happening at a speed. The technology and the tactics and the means to defeat counter defenses and technology is evolving at a rapid pace, and at a pace I don't believe we've seen in other conflicts.
As a photojournalist, what are you able to capture through your photography, and what is harder to capture or to portray?
There is things you can capture. I'd like to think that I could capture the emotions, some of the emotions that are people are going through, and have that be an indication to the reader that what these people are suffering through, and just how they're reacting, the danger that they're reacting to. But still photos, I'm aware that still photos do have their own limitations, so it's hard to, for instance, just a simple thing, war is very loud. Like, there's when things are dropping out of the sky and exploding, there's no real way to capture how loud that is in a still photo. But I'm a believer in print media, even though it's evolved to be digitally distributed. I believe there is a great deal of value in the written word and having photographs to accompany that. So I'm fine working within the limitations of still photography, because I think there is an inherent value in freezing and capturing a specific moment amongst the chaos, and amongst the destruction.
There's a lot going on in the world at the moment, big geopolitical events and upheaval. How do you see the role of a photojournalist in a time like this?
I don't see the role of a photojournalist, at least in the manner that I approach it, as being very different than it has been historically. I think that we document events and tell people stories in an accurate and truthful manner, and we convey that information to the public. And I don't really see a reason to stray outside of that. One of my colleagues, Finbar O'Reilly, had written an op-ed in the Washington Post, actually, about how photojournalists play a specific role in society. We provide information, but what's done with that information is to a large degree out of our hands. People, by voting, and the economic choices they make and the leaders they support, have a great deal of power. And then there's leaders in business and billionaires and politicians that have a great deal of changes that they can, that individuals can make and that people can collectively make. But we're not necessarily on that side of it. We give you the information to make decisions that you may think will better the world. But I remain, solely dedicated to providing that information in the most comprehensive and truthful way possible. I don't believe that we should, dabble in activism. I don't think that that's not our role in society. We tell people what's going on and show them what's going on, and hopefully beyond that, we can put a human face, and kind of drill down on the specific experience of an individual in a larger news story, or in the larger story of the conflict.
You've covered big pivotal moments around the world, including big political movements, unrest, protests. How do you see the world changing through your lens?
I guess the best way to answer that would be that uh, the repression. I guess a lot of what I've been covering is protests, and I got started documenting the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that democracy and democratic norms, to an extent, are backsliding. If you look at the repression of free speech, or the repression of peaceful protests, that has been gradually increasing. And the time I've been in photojournalism, and I believe that bad behavior by governments tends to beget other bad behavior by other governments. And the more, governments such as my own as an American, tend to deviate from the rule of law or from democratic norms, that tends to grant license to more autocratic or authoritarian governments to repress the expression of political statements by their citizens, because there's not as much of a stark contrast between the two.
Given that you've documented so much oppression, people being downtrodden, and like you said, you account a lot of this to bad policy by leaders, but do you see much hope when you're going about your work?
I believe there is hope. I'd like to think that ultimately I'm not responsible, or maybe not responsible isn't the right word, but I can't control how people receive my work. But I'd like to think I spend a great deal of time thinking about, whether my work shows a comprehensive picture of what's occurring in a society, or comprehensive to the extent that I'm capable of as one individual. And it's one of the reasons why I spent so much time working with, humanitarian organizations in Ukraine, is because I believe the governments will continue to use violence to achieve political aims, and that's not going to stop. But there are, in every situation I've seen where acts of violence are occurring, there's always been someone, usually a whole bunch of people, that are attempting to ameliorate that, or to save people from those situations, or just to make their lives better in the face of that, continued violence. And I think that's starkly present in Ukraine, because I spent some time documenting the All-Ukrainian Center for Rehabilitation and Prosthetics in Odessa, and there was a number of other humanitarian organizations where I was able to document their work. And these are people, if you look at Dobre Spava with the evacuations, these are people who are working very hard and often risking their lives, either to save the lives of strangers or just to improve their lives. As long as that compassion exists in society, as long as such a generosity of spirit and such a bravery and a kindness towards towards veritable strangers exists in society, there will always be hope, or I consider that at least to be a great sign of hope.
And is there a particular moment or experience that has stuck with you that you'd like to share with us?
There is a particular story I'd like to tell. In late July, I was working in a rural town in eastern Kharkiv Oblast called Verkily Baluk. There's a tendency to see war as something that happens in forests and happens amongst soldiers in the middle of the woods. But I'd very much like to stress that wars don't happen in a vacuum. Civilians are being impacted by all the same weapons that the soldiers fighting the war are. There was a situation where I was in Verkily Baluk, and there's a gentleman named Sergei Zamosov. He was a firefighter in Verkily Baluk. He spends the majority of his days extinguishing fires that are caused by bombs and drone attacks from the Russian military. One day, he responded to a burning and destroyed home to find that his wife, Ina Samazova, had been killed in the attack. And his 10-year-old son had been injured and was taken to the hospital, was thankfully, physically okay. But, this gentleman went to work. He's not a soldier. He's just trying to help his people. And, he lost his wife, and he wasn't, I can't stress how much suffering and destruction the Russian government and the Russian military have brought to the people of Ukraine.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to hear all of your insights about working in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from Taiwan and around the world, you can follow TaiwanPlus News on social media. I've been Rik Glauert, and we will see you next time.